Hi, I'm David, and this is yet another Talkie Talk on my YouTube channel. Today we're talking about keys versus modes, and I believe that there are different ways of looking at music. A lot of people use different ways, and I know some wonderful musicians who really don't know how to sight read. They just have a wonderfully intuitive grasp of key sense and notes. But I'm a technical guy, and I like knowing what I'm doing. And I looked into modes a lot, and I found that I preferred being based on keys, and I'm going to explain why in this talk. First of all, we're going to talk about what modes are, where they come from, and talk about what scales arise as you work your way through the different modes in a particular key. Then I'm going to explain how any mode is really just a key change, depending on your relative starting point. And we're going to talk about how to work this into your improvisation. Where do modes come from? Let's go back over some of the basics. In European Western style music, there are 12 notes in an octave. Not everybody in the world has 12 notes in the octave. Some have more, some have fewer. Now, what that means is that a note like A220 and the next day A440 is exactly double. And within that range from 220 to 440, we make 12 intervals, 12 chunks come out of that. The next interval from 440 to 880 has 12, but obviously they can't be the same size because you're covering more frequencies. Out of those 12 tones, 7 are chosen as the diatonic or major scale. And the gaps between them are measured in what are called half steps. A half step is the smallest interval in our style of music, and there are exactly 12 in every octave. So the pattern for the major scale is 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1. Call them half steps, call them frets, doesn't matter, same thing. If we start from C, we would get the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Very simple. The modes arise by changing the starting point of this pattern, and we'll see how that works. Here is the full 12-tone octave as a clock. And that's cool because clocks have 12 hours and so does the octave have 12 half steps. If you look at the chart, the yellow wedges are the white keys on a piano. They're the notes of the diatonic C scale. The blue wedges are accidentals. These are notes that will not be played unless somebody puts a sharper flat in the score. Now, notice I don't have a note name in there because it's the same thing in every key with every starting note. Now the piano, it doesn't look like that because if you move from C to D flat on the piano, all of a sudden you're playing a whole lot of black keys. On the guitar, if you have a movable C scale, you just move up one fret and do exactly the same thing. You're playing in D flat. So keys are all equivalent. They're all the same. They all have the same patterns and internal intervals and structure. If we, however, ignore these accidental points, the blue wedges, we get something that looks like this. In this chart, I've made the intervals in the major scale the same size, but just put a number to indicate that they're different sizes in reality. And there's 7 of them. And then if you start over here and you move around the circle, you get back to the top. So if we do that, we get 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1. Now, the ancient Greeks gave each of these positions a name. And the name they call, what we call the major scale, they call the Ionian mode. What we call the natural minor, they call the Aeolian mode. And then there's modes for every other position in this range. Note that any particular note can only appear in 7 of the possible 12 keys because there's only 7 notes in the standard key, so there's only 7 rolls to be taken. And that means that if you have a key like, say, G flat, there's no C natural in G flat. It isn't there because it's not part of the pattern. Now, the basic modes are simply starting the scale like the C scale from a different point. So if you start on C, that's Ionian. If you start on D, that's Dorian. But notice in the interval sequence, what we've done is we've taken the Ionian sequence, and to make the Dorian sequence, I take the first thing off the front of the Ionian sequence and move it to the back. And we keep doing that all the way down the chart. But these modes are not particularly interesting. Where you get some interesting stuff is when you start at the same position. And here you get the same names, but if you look at the Ionian pattern, obviously with 221, 2221, we get C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. But let's move to the Dorian, which is just number 2. Now we've taken that first 2 off the rotated pattern, put it on the end, and we get 2-1, 2-2-2, 1-2. And what that gives us is C, D, E flat, F, G, A, B flat, C. Now, what is that? Well, it's got 2 flats. And if you look at it closely, it's just the key of B flat with a different starting point, okay? Now we can keep going down the line and you can see that every one of these modes has a corresponding key. So if you're playing along in the Aeolian mode in C, you're really playing in E flat. And by the way, E flat is the same key signature as its relative minor, C minor, and we'll talk about that too. So each mode is really a different key, and you can use the relative key signature column on this chart to determine the modes and their respective keys in starting from any tonic or root note. So to review all this, the major scale pattern is 221, 2221. There's one major key for each of the 12 possible notes. Any note appears in only 7 of those keys, and the pattern is a cycle. Modes arise from beginning that cycle at a different point from a given starting note. Let's talk about keys, modes, and improvisation. How are modes used? Well, a lot of guitar players, guitar methods, guitar teachers use modes for effectively 2 purposes that I've found. One is they want a little variety in their playing, so they learn some modes and they can throw that mode in there. The most common example of this is the blues, where they're typically playing in the Aeolian mode over the major scale. We'll talk about that in a minute. Another one is to have alternative fingering patterns so that you can learn some different fingerings along the way. However, I'm a big believer in the cage system, at least my interpretation of the cage system, where if you learn something like the closed form, that is to say movable patterns for C, E, and G across the 2 octaves of the 6 strings of the guitar, you can play everything in 2 octaves without having to slide up and down the neck, without changing. It's the same thing all the time. When you want to go to a different octave, you link to that octave and you move your hand around to a different one of those basic patterns, C, E, or G. Now there's other ones, obviously. There's A and D, but they're not quite as common. When you use keys in improvisation, there's several cases where you might want to do this, but the most common cases I'll talk about now. But I think it's still simple to think in terms of key changes than it is to think in terms of modes. But one of the most important things to do is to notice and recognize internal key changes in songs. You get a lot of this in rock, you get a lot of it in pop, you get a lot of it especially in jazz. And when that happens, dealing with them as key changes and not mode changes is a lot easier. The biggest example is the blues. Now the blues doesn't have a fixed definition, but when I'm playing it, I'm thinking in terms of chords in a major key, like C, that would be C, F, and G7 or G. And the notes that I'm improvising with are in the key of C minor. C minor is the same scale as E flat. So really I'm playing an E flat over C. What does a modal player do? Well, the modal player chooses to play in the Aeolian mode. And that effectively is doing exactly the same thing. In both cases, though, the players would typically restrict themselves to the pentatonic scale, which is a smaller grouping of 5 notes from the 7 possible. Which is easier? Well, it's the same notes, but I can think about these things much more readily by saying, okay, I'm in C, I want to play the blues, therefore it's C minor, therefore it's E flat, and I'm off to the races. One of the things we have to talk about is detecting interior key changes in songs. By that I mean a key change that's typically not noted in the score. There's no place where all of a sudden you've got a different key change. Sometimes that happens, and then it's like a big flag. Okay, here we're changing keys, big deal, no big deal. A lot of times there are short key changes that last from 1 to 10 measures that are in a different key. And the question is, how do you spot that and what do you do about it? Well, the primary indicators are first, a 2 minor 5/7 transition from a different key. We'll talk about that in detail. The good news about that one is that it's It tells you exactly what key to go into. The bad news, it's a little harder to spot. An easy one to spot is a set of accidentals in a melody. That is to say, sharps and flats in the melody, the things that are not in the key, whatever the key signature might be. They'll often spell out the key signature of a key that you're moving into for a brief time. And the other is when a chord comes up in the chord arrangement that is not in the key that you're playing. And we'll talk about that. And I use an idea that I call key distance minimization. When I don't have enough information to know exactly what key to go into, I try to find one that's very near to the key that I'm in, and we'll talk about that. The type of clue that you're changing keys that tells you exactly what key to go into is the 2 minor 5/7 chord transition. It's the most common clue in composition for a key change, especially in jazz. Now the table on the right tells you every one of these guys. So if I'm playing in C and I hear and I see on the score D minor and G7, well, that's a 2 minor 5/7 transition, but it's the same key that I'm in. So it's a 2 minor 5/7 transition, but the key is still C. If, however, there's an E minor and an A7, well, that's a key transition to a different key. That key is D. And one of the clues is the A7 is not in the key of C, not normally. So what are you looking for? You're looking for a change where the two chords are a fourth apart. The first chord is a minor and the second chord is a major. And as I say on the slide there, you just have to know this. This is just stuff you need to recognize. So the first thing you learn about a new key is what are 1, 4, 5. Like if you're saying D, it's DGA. Your minors are going to be B minor, E minor, and F sharp minor. You need to know that. But after that, what is your 2 minor 5/7 transition? And that would be B minor to E7 in the key of D. E minor to A7 in the key of D. Key distance minimization is something I developed in my own little head about how to figure out what to do when you're confronted with a situation that is uncertain. For example, I'm in C and all of a sudden I get a chord of B flat. Okay, well, B flat is obviously not in the key of C because the note B flat isn't in the key of C. So the question comes in, what do I play over if I'm jamming away? Well, the answer is every major or minor chord appears natively in only 3 keys. So B flat only shows up in 3 different keys. One of them is not C, by the way. Well, one of them, of course, is B flat. The other is E flat, and the third is F. Well, B flat has 2 flats in its key signature. E flat has 3, but F has only 1. So F is only one accidental away, the key of F is only one accidental away from the key of C. So my answer is play an F, because you'll be able to play over that B flat chord without jarring the listener by changing everything you're playing, and you'll often be able to drop back into the C with no trouble at all. So I use keys instead of modes because I basically play caged patterns across the fretboard. And I use movable scales and open scales, and you really only need to learn one reliable pattern. There are only a few in the cage system. That's what it's good about, is it reduces the complexity of every possible scale down to just a small number. And I perceive personally that if you have a mind that works in key changes, it's simpler and it's easier. And one more thing I'll say is that when you're moving from one key to another, like you're moving from C to F, what do you play in the middle of the transition? You typically play notes that are in both keys. So from C to F, that's trivial, because you got everything but B. But if you go from, say, C to E flat, you've got fewer choices. You've got G and you've got D and you've got C, and you've got F. But you have to choose that, and sometimes you just have to know that. Now, what do you do about the learning process? How do you gain proficiency in many keys? This is going to be the topic of a future talk. Thanks very much for watching.